Welcome, brave souls, to the realm of shadows. I am Ghost Boy, your guide through tales that chill the bones and twist the mind. Tonight we dive into a story steeped in suspense, thick with thrills and brimming with unexpected twists, a journey that will keep you on the edge of your seat. As we unravel the haunting secrets of Maple Street, prepare yourself for a gripping experience where every whisper of the wind could be a warning, and every flicker of light might be a ghostly reminder of the past. Will you dare to confront the darkness with me? If you're ready, let's begin. It was the night of October 31st, Halloween, in the quiet suburban town of Winfield, USA. Nestled on the edge of town was Maple Street, a neighborhood known for its festive Halloween decorations, children trick-or-treating, and houses brimming with eerie charm. But that Halloween, no one could anticipate the terrifying darkness that would unfold. The story begins with a family who had recently moved into an old Victorian house on Maple Street. The Hudsons, Jack, his wife Emily, and their 2 children, were excited about starting fresh. The house was a century-old masterpiece with creaking wooden floors, towering windows, and ivy creeping up its walls. Despite its beauty, the locals avoided it. Rumors whispered of strange occurrences, unexplained sounds, and shadowy figures seen late at night. But the Hudsons didn't believe in ghosts. They chalked it up to superstition and the spooky legends that every small town seemed to have. On Halloween night, as the neighborhood buzzed with excitement, the Hudsons decided to throw a small party for the local children. Emily decorated the house with carved pumpkins, spider webs, and eerie lights. Everything seemed perfect until strange things began to happen. It started with the faint sound of footsteps coming from the upstairs bedroom, a room that no one had entered. At first, Jack brushed it off, thinking it was just the old house settling. But when the sound grew louder and more distinct, as if someone or something was pacing back and forth, he knew something wasn't right. "Emily, do you hear that?" Jack asked, his voice tinged with unease. Emily paused, her eyes narrowing. She heard it too. Soft, deliberate footsteps echoing through the house. But before they could investigate, the doorbell rang, interrupting the eerie moment. The trick-or-treaters had arrived. The children came in groups, laughing and playing, oblivious to the sinister atmosphere building inside the Hudsons' home. As the party went on, Jack couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time he glanced at the darkened corners of the room, he thought he saw movement, shadows shifting unnaturally. But whenever he focused, there was nothing. The evening grew darker and the children started to leave one by one until only a few remained. That's when the real horror began. Suddenly, the power went out. The entire house plunged into darkness, and the only light came from the flickering candles and glowing jack-o'-lanterns outside. Emily's voice broke the silence. "Jack, what's happening?" But as he made his way to the basement, the footsteps upstairs grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of whispering. Low, indistinct voices that seemed to float through the air. Jack froze, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure whether to investigate the basement or head upstairs. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, the whispers turned into a chilling wail. It echoed through the house, sending shivers down Jack's spine. The children screamed, and Emily rushed to comfort them, but they were all on edge. One of the children, a little girl named Lily, pointed towards the staircase. "Look," she cried. "There's someone up there." Jack turned, his blood running cold. At the top of the staircase, illuminated by the faint candlelight, stood a figure, tall, shadowy, and completely still. Its face was hidden, but Jack could feel its gaze, heavy and malevolent. He tried to speak, but his throat felt tight. Time seemed to slow down as the figure took a step forward, and then another. It was coming closer. Without thinking, Jack grabbed Emily and the children, pulling them towards the front door. But when he turned the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, sealed shut as if by some invisible force. Panic set in. "Jack, we need to get out of here," Emily shouted, her voice trembling with fear. "I'm trying," Jack yelled back, frantically pulling at the door. But before they could escape, a loud crash echoed through the house. The figure at the top of the stairs was gone, but the footsteps were louder now, faster, as if running through the house, circling them. Every corner seemed to hum with dark energy, the air thick with dread. Then came the whispers again, but this time they were clear. "Get out, leave now." Jack and Emily exchanged terrified glances. They knew this wasn't just a haunted house, it was something much worse. Something evil was trying to force them out. But how? They were trapped. Just as they were about to lose hope, the front door flung open with a violent force, nearly knocking Jack to the ground. They didn't waste a second. Grabbing the kids, they bolted outside into the cold, crisp Halloween night. The moment they stepped off the porch, the power in the house flickered back on. After their terrifying escape from the house, the Hudson family found themselves standing in the middle of Maple Street, shivering in the cold night air. Their minds raced, still grappling with what had just happened. The house loomed behind them, dark and silent, as if mocking their fear. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He kept replaying the events in his mind. The whispers, the figure on the staircase, the impossible force locking them inside. Emily held their children close, her face pale, her hands trembling. "What was that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. I don't know," Jack stammered, glancing back at the house. "But whatever it was, we can't go back in there." The other families in the neighborhood were still celebrating Halloween, blissfully unaware of the horror that had unfolded in the Hudson house. Jack looked around, hoping to find someone who might help. But the street was mostly empty, and the distant laughter of children seemed like a world away from their nightmare. The Hudsons walked down the street to their neighbors, the Davis family, who lived a few houses down. Jack knocked urgently on the door, and when Mr. Davis opened it, he immediately saw the fear in Jack's eyes. "Jack, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jack forced a shaky laugh. "Something happened at the house. I can't explain it. We need to stay here for the night." "Please." Mr. Davis's expression turned serious. He looked past Jack at the dark figure of the Hudson house in the distance. "You know, strange things have always happened in that house," he said quietly. "People don't talk about it much, but you're not the first family to have experienced something unsettling." "What do you mean?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Mr. Davis hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue. "That house has a history. Decades ago, before it was renovated, it was owned by a man named Victor Grayson. Grayson was different. People in town used to say he was involved in the occult. He kept to himself mostly, but there were rumors, dark rumors. Some said he performed rituals trying to communicate with spirits. Others claimed he was trying to summon something unnatural. One night he vanished without a trace, and no one ever found out what happened to him." Jack's stomach turned. He had heard bits and pieces of local legends, but nothing this specific. "Do you think whatever was in our house tonight has something to do with Grayson?" Mr. Davis nodded slowly. "It's possible. Over the years, families who moved into that house reported strange occurrences. Objects moving on their own, voices in the night, cold spots. Some even claimed they saw Grayson's shadowy figure. But you're the first to have an experience this extreme." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from outside, cutting through the night. Jack and Mr. Davis rushed to the window, looking out at Maple Street. What they saw made their blood run cold. The Hudson house was no longer quiet. Every light inside had turned on at once, flickering violently, casting eerie shadows through the windows. The front door, which they had left wide open when they fled, was now slowly creaking shut, as if an invisible hand was pulling it closed. "We need to get the kids out of here," Jack said urgently. He turned to Emily, who was already gathering their things. "We can't stay in this neighborhood." But before they could leave, the power in the Davis house cut out, plunging them into complete darkness. "Not again," Emily gasped, clutching the children. Jack fumbled for his phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the blackness, but as he swept it across the room, something strange caught his eye. A shadow, darker than the rest, moving unnaturally along the walls. "It's here," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. The shadow grew larger, stretching from the corners of the room, creeping toward them. Jack aimed the light directly at it, but it only seemed to distort and shift, moving faster now. The air grew cold, so cold that they could see their breath in front of them. The children huddled together, terrified. "Whatever this is, it followed us," Emily said, her voice trembling. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted and a low growl filled the air. It was coming from the shadow, now massive and swirling like a living storm. The growl turned into a whisper, low and menacing, the same voice they had heard in their house. But this time the words were clearer. "Victor Grayson is not dead." Jack's heart skipped a beat. He glanced at Mr. Davis, who looked pale and shaken. "What is that thing?" "I don't know, Mr. Davis whispered. "But we need to get out of here, now." Without wasting another second, they rushed toward the door, but as they did, the shadow lunged at them. It was fast, faster than anything Jack had ever seen. He felt a cold hand grip his arm, and for a moment, it was as if the world slowed down. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the shadow seemed to seep into his skin, chilling him to the bone. But then, just as quickly as it had grabbed him, it released him. Jack staggered back, gasping for air. Emily pulled him to his feet, her eyes wide with fear. "Jack, are you okay?" Yeah, I think so," Jack stammered, though his mind was racing. What was that thing, and why had it let him go? They burst out of the house and into the street, where a thick fog had rolled in, blanketing the neighborhood in an eerie, ghostly white. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. In the distance, the Hudson house stood, still lit up like a beacon of terror. "We need to leave town," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "There's something evil here." As they hurried to their car, the fog seemed to follow them, swirling and thickening. Jack fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and finally got the door open. They all piled in, slamming the door shut just as the shadowy fog reached the car. For a moment, the vehicle rocked as if something was pressing against it, trying to get inside. But then, with a violent screech, the fog dissipated, leaving the car still and silent. They drove out of Maple Street as fast as they could, not daring to look back at the house that had become the center of their nightmare. The Hudson family's escape from Maple Street was only the beginning of their ordeal. Despite the shadowy presence in the car, they managed to drive for miles, leaving the small town of Winfield behind them. The road stretched endlessly before them, winding through thick woods that seemed to close in the further they drove. Jack's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his heart pounding in his chest. Emily sat beside him, her eyes glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadow reappear at any moment. The children, huddled together in the back seat, were silent, their faces pale with fear. "Jack, where are we going?" Emily asked, her voice shaky. "We can't just keep driving. Forever." Jack glanced over at her, his face tense. "I don't know, but we need to get as far away from that house as possible, from whatever's following us." He stole another glance at the rearview mirror. The shadow he had seen before was gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered, a cold presence that clung to the air around them. It wasn't over. Jack knew that much. After what felt like hours, they came across a small roadside motel, the kind that seemed almost too quiet for the late hour. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie red glow across the empty parking lot. "This will have to do," Jack said, pulling into the lot. He didn't know how far they could run, but for now they needed rest. Inside the cramped motel room, the atmosphere was tense. The walls were thin, and the faint sound of the wind outside did nothing to calm their nerves. The children were exhausted and fell asleep almost immediately, but Jack and Emily sat on the edge of the bed, wide awake. "What do we do now?" Emily whispered. "We can't run forever." Jack sighed, rubbing his face. "I don't know. Maybe tomorrow we can find someone who knows more about this Grayson guy, or the house. There has to be something we're missing." As they spoke, a low rumble echoed through the room. At first they thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, louder this time. It wasn't a natural sound, it was more like breathing slow, deliberate, and menacing. Jack's eyes widened and he motioned for Emily to stay quiet. They both held their breath, listening. The sound seemed to be coming from outside the window. Jack stood up slowly, creeping toward the curtain. He pulled it back just an inch and peered outside. There was nothing there, but the breathing continued, growing louder and more erratic, as if something unseen was circling the motel. "Jack?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide with fear. "It's here." Before Jack could respond, the lights in the room flickered and the temperature dropped dramatically. Their breath turned to mist in front of them, and a deep, guttural growl filled the air. Suddenly, the children bolted upright in bed, their eyes wide with terror. "Dad," their son screamed, pointing to the corner of the room. Jack spun around and his heart nearly stopped. In the corner, where the shadows were deepest, stood a figure. A tall, dark silhouette, its face obscured by the shadows. It was the same figure they had seen on the staircase in their house, the same one that had followed them. Victor Grayson. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching them, its presence oppressive and overwhelming. Jack felt an icy grip on his chest, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. "What do you want?" Jack shouted, stepping in front of his family. The figure didn't respond, but the growling intensified, reverberating through the walls. The lights flickered violently, and then with a loud pop, the bulbs shattered, plunging the room into darkness. Emily grabbed the children, pulling them close. Jack fumbled for his phone, using the flashlight to scan the room. The figure was gone, but the feeling of its presence remained heavy and suffocating. "We need to get out of here," Emily cried, rushing toward the door. But when Jack tried to turn the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was locked again, just like it had been back at the house. He pulled harder, but the door wouldn't move. It was as if some invisible force was holding it shut. Suddenly, the room seemed to warp. The walls stretched, the ceiling twisted, and the floor beneath them shifted unnaturally. The growling gave way to whispers, dozens of voices overlapping, echoing in the small space. They spoke in a language Jack couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Malicious, angry. Then out of the darkness, a voice broke through, clear and cold. "You shouldn't have come here." It was the same voice they had heard in the house, the voice of Victor Grayson. Jack felt his blood run cold as the temperature in the room dropped even further. His skin prickled and a deep dread settled in his chest. "Who are you?" Jack shouted, his voice shaking. The voice laughed, a low, chilling sound. "You're already mine." Suddenly, the room fell silent. The temperature returned to normal and the lights flickered back on. Jack looked around, his heart racing. The figure was gone. The growling had stopped and the door was now unlocked, hanging ajar. Emily was already at the door, clutching the children tightly. "We need to leave, Jack." Now they didn't waste another second. Grabbing their belongings, they rushed out of the motel room and into the car. Jack's hands trembled as he started the engine, and they sped away from the motel without looking back. As they drove down the deserted highway, the night felt darker than before. The road stretching endlessly ahead. No matter how far they went, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being followed, that the shadow of Victor Grayson was never far behind. "What do we do now, Jack?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Jack replied, his voice hollow. "But we need help. Real help. Someone who knows what's going on." Emily nodded. Fear etched on her face. Who could possibly know how to stop this? Jack thought for a moment, then remembered something. "There was a man in town," he said, "a historian, I think. He used to give tours about the history of Winfield, and I remember hearing that he knew a lot about the town's dark past. Maybe he can tell us something about Grayson." It was a long shot, but it was the only lead they had. Jack turned the car around and headed back toward Winfield. Every mile felt like a risk, but they had no other choice. The next morning, they arrived at the historian's house, a small cluttered cottage on the outskirts of town. The door creaked open before Jack even knocked, and a frail elderly man stood in the doorway. His eyes were sunken and his face was gaunt, as if he hadn't slept in years. "You're here about the house, aren't you?" the man said, his voice raspy. Jack blinked in surprise. "How did you know?" The man smiled grimly. "Because I've been expecting you. I know all about Victor Grayson, and the curse that comes with that house." He motioned for them to come inside, and the Hudson family stepped into the dimly lit home. The air smelled of old books and dust, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with ancient tomes and strange artifacts. The historian sat down at a small wooden table and gestured for them to do the same. "You've seen him, haven't you? The shadow, the figure that haunts that house." Jack nodded, feeling a chill run down his spine. "Yes, he's followed us everywhere we go." The historian sighed, his bony fingers tapping on the table. "That's because you've awakened something ancient, something that was never meant to be disturbed." "Who is Victor Grayson?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "Why is he haunting us?" The historian leaned back in his chair, his eyes darkening. Victor Grayson was a man obsessed with power. Power that came from the darkest corners of the supernatural world. He wasn't just a man, he became something else, something far more dangerous. He performed rituals, sacrifices, anything to gain control over forces no human should ever touch. Jack's stomach churned. But why us? Why now? The historian shook his head. "Because you moved into his house. And once you set foot in that house, you became part of the cursed Grayson's spirit isn't at rest. He's trapped between worlds and he feeds off the fear and suffering of those who enter his domain." "But we've left the house," Emily cried. "Why is he still following us?" The historian's eyes grew cold. "Because it's not just the house that's cursed, it's you. And until you find a way to break the curse, Grayson will never stop. He will follow you, torment you until there's nothing left." Jack's heart sank. "How do we stop him?" The historian leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "There's only one way. You must return to the house and finish what Grayson started." Jack and Emily sat in stunned silence, the weight of the historian's words sinking into their minds like stones. The dim light of the historian's small cottage flickered overhead, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. Their children sat close to them, silent but wide-eyed with fear. The historian, old and gaunt, gazed at them with a knowing look. He had seen this before, and he knew how it would end if they did nothing. "Return to the house," Jack finally said, breaking the silence. "You're telling us we have to go back to that place?" The historian nodded slowly. "It's the only way. Victor Grayson's spirit is tied to that house. The rituals he performed there have anchored him to this world. If you don't return and confront him, he will continue to follow you, tormenting you and your family. You'll never escape." Emily's face turned pale. "But how do we stop him? What do we do once we're back in that house?" The historian leaned forward, his voice low and grave. "You need to complete the ritual. Grayson never finished it, which is why his spirit remains restless. To break the curse, you must finish what he started, but be warned. The ritual is dangerous. If you fail, you may never leave the house again." Jack's hands tightened into fists. He had thought they were finally free, but now it seemed they were trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end until they faced the evil head-on. "What kind of ritual are we talking about?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The historian reached into an old drawer and pulled out a leather-bound book. It looked ancient, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. He placed it on the table in front of them, his fingers tracing the strange symbols on the cover. "This," he said, "is Grayson's journal. It contains the instructions for the ritual he was attempting to perform. I've studied it for years, trying to understand what he was doing. It's dangerous, yes, but it's the only way to send him back to the world he came from." Emily stared at the book, her eyes wide with fear. "You're asking us to summon him to confront him directly?" The historian shook his head. "Not summon him. He's already here, already with you. What you need to do is bind his spirit, force it out of this world. The ritual will close the door he opened and seal him away. Forever." Jack swallowed hard, his mind racing. The thought of returning to that house, of facing whatever evil still lurked there, made his blood run cold. But there was no other choice. If they wanted to save their family, they had to do it. "When do we need to do this?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tonight," the historian replied. "The veil between the worlds is thinnest on Halloween. It's the only time you'll have the chance to complete the ritual and trap him. If you wait, he'll only grow stronger." Jack glanced at Emily, who was trembling but nodded in determination. They had no other option. They couldn't live like this, constantly running, constantly looking over their shoulders. "We'll do it," Jack said, his voice firmer now. "We'll go back." The historian handed them the journal, his bony fingers lingering on the cover for a moment as if he was passing along a great burden. "Read the instructions carefully. You'll need to prepare certain items, symbols, and chants. Don't miss a single step. One mistake, and you could be trapped with him." Emily looked at the historian, her voice wavering. "Has anyone ever survived this?" The historian's eyes darkened. "Very few have tried. Even fewer have succeeded. But you must succeed for your family's sake." With the journal in hand and a plan set, Jack and Emily left the historian's house, the weight of what they were about to face hanging heavily over them. As they drove back toward Winfield, the air seemed colder, the darkness of the night more oppressive. By the time they reached Maple Street, it was nearly midnight. The fog had rolled in thick, swallowing up the houses and casting eerie shadows in every direction. The Hudson house stood at the end of the street, dark and foreboding, as if waiting for them to return. Jack parked the car a few houses away. The children were terrified but too exhausted to protest. Jack and Emily tucked them into the back seat, leaving the doors unlocked in case they needed to make a quick getaway. "Stay here," Jack said, his voice trembling slightly. "We'll be back soon." The house loomed before them, a hulking mass of darkness and silence. Jack and Emily approached it cautiously, the wind howling through the trees. The front door, which they had seen slam shut on its own before, now creaked open as they approached, as if inviting them inside. Jack gripped the journal tightly. The strange symbols and instructions burned into his mind. The first step was to draw the binding symbols around the house. They needed to create a circle of protection that would trap Grayson's spirit within the walls. Without the circle, the ritual would fail. They began in the yard, carefully tracing the ancient symbols into the dirt, their breath visible in the cold air. The wind whipped at their faces, but they pressed on, their hands shaking as they completed the circle as they worked. The house seemed to come alive. The windows rattled and a low, ominous hum filled the air. Jack could feel it, the presence of something dark and malevolent watching them from inside. Once the circle was complete, they stepped back, catching their breath. The air felt heavier now, charged with an unnatural energy. "It's time," Jack said, opening the journal to the page with the ritual instructions. "We need to go inside." Emily nodded, though her face was pale with fear. Together they entered the house, the door creaking shut behind them. The air inside was colder than before, and the darkness seemed to press in on them from all sides. The house was eerily quiet, but Jack could feel it. The same presence they had felt before Victor Grayson was here, waiting for them. They made their way to the living room, where the final part of the ritual needed to be performed. Jack placed the journal on the floor and began arranging the objects they had brought with them. Candles, salt, and an old mirror that the historian had insisted was key to trapping Grayson's spirit. Emily lit the candles, her hands shaking. "Jack, I'm scared." "I know," Jack said, his voice barely steady. "But we can do this. We have to." As they set everything in place, the temperature in the room dropped even further. Their breath turned to mist in front of them, and the low growl they had heard before began to fill the air. The candles flickered violently, and the shadows in the room seemed to twist and writhe as if alive. Jack began reciting the ancient chant from the journal, his voice shaky but determined. Suddenly, a deafening crash echoed through the house, and the growling grew louder. Jack's voice faltered for a moment, but he pushed on, the words tumbling out of his mouth faster and faster. Emily clutched the mirror, her eyes wide with terror as she stared into its reflection. And then they saw him. Victor Grayson's shadowy figure appeared in the corner of the room, towering over them, his eyes burning with a malevolent light. The growling intensified, shaking the very walls of the house. Grayson's voice echoed through the room, cold and sinister. "You think you can stop me?" Jack didn't respond. He couldn't. He focused on the chant, his voice rising above the noise, desperate to finish the ritual before it was too late. The figure stepped closer, the air around him freezing cold. Emily screamed as the shadow reached out toward them, its fingers long and clawed. "Finish it, Jack," Emily cried, holding up the mirror as a shield. With a final desperate shout, Jack spoke the last words of the chant. The candles flared, and the air in the room seemed to implode, sucking all the light and sound into the center of the circle. The shadow of Victor Grayson let out a terrible, ear-piercing scream as he was drawn into the mirror, his form twisting and writhing in agony. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The room fell silent, the air still. The candles burned low, casting a soft, flickering light. Victor Grayson was gone. Jack collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. Emily rushed to him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Did it work?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded, too exhausted to speak. They had done it. They had finished the ritual. The curse was broken. The Hudson family sat in stunned silence in the middle of the living room, the flickering candles casting ghostly shadows on the walls. The eerie hum that had filled the house moments before had vanished. The air, once thick with malice, felt lighter now. Jack and Emily exchanged exhausted glances, their hearts still racing from the ritual they had just performed. Victor Grayson was gone, or so they hoped. Jack pulled himself off the floor, his legs trembling with fatigue. He glanced at the mirror in Emily's hands, which now seemed just like any ordinary mirror, reflecting nothing but their pale faces. The dark, twisted figure that had haunted them for so long was no longer there. "Is it over?" Emily whispered, still clutching the mirror, her knuckles white with fear. Jack nodded, though uncertainty still gnawed at the edges of his mind. "It has to be." The ritual worked. For the first time in days, they felt a glimmer of hope. They had done what the historian had told them, completed the ritual, trapped Victor Grayson's spirit, and finally broken the curse that had haunted them since the day they moved into the house on Maple Street. But even as the adrenaline began to fade, a cold dread lingered in the pit of Jack's stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. "Let's get the kids," Jack said quietly, helping Emily to her feet. "We need to leave this place for good." They hurried out of the house, the wind whipping through the trees as they stepped into the cold night air. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the familiar outline of their car parked a few houses away. The sight of it brought them a wave of relief. When they reached the car, their children were still asleep in the back seat, huddled under blankets, unaware of the horrors their parents had just faced. Jack and Emily exchanged weary smiles. They had done it. They were safe. Jack slid into the driver's seat and started the car. The engine hummed softly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the world seemed quiet, peaceful, even. They drove away from Maple Street, leaving the haunted house and everything that had happened there behind. "I can't believe it's over," Emily said, her voice barely audible over the sound of the road beneath the tires. "We survived." Jack nodded. Though he kept his eyes on the road, his mind still racing. The historian had warned them that the ritual was dangerous, that one mistake could leave them trapped with Grayson forever. But they had done everything right, hadn't they? "I think we should stop at a motel," Jack said after a long silence. "We need rest. We've been through too much." Emily agreed, and within an hour they found a small, quiet motel on the outskirts of town. It was old, but it was clean and far from Maple Street, which was all that mattered to them now. They checked in, carrying their sleeping children into the room. For the first time in days, they collapsed into bed, too exhausted to speak. The children were safe, fast asleep in the next bed. The nightmare was finally over. But that night, Jack dreamed in his dream. He was back in the house on Maple Street. The walls stretched endlessly around him, twisting and turning like a maze. He was alone, standing in the middle of the living room, surrounded by shadows. The air was cold, so cold that his breath turned to mist in front of him. And then, from the darkness, a voice whispered, low, cold, and familiar. "You thought you could stop me?" Jack's heart raced. He turned, searching for the source of the voice, but saw nothing. Only darkness. "You think you're free," the voice taunted, growing louder, more menacing. "You think you can run from me?" Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. The same tall, twisted figure that had haunted them before, Victor Grayson. His eyes glowed with a sinister light and his face twisted into a horrible grin. "You'll never be free," Grayson hissed. "I am eternal. And you belong to me." Jack screamed, bolting upright in bed, drenched in cold sweat. His chest heaved as he gasped for air, his heart pounding in his ears. The room was dark, but the air around him felt heavy, suffocating. It was just a dream, he told himself. Just a nightmare. But something was wrong. Beside him, Emily stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Jack, what's wrong?" Jack opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The mirror. It was propped up against the wall. The same mirror they had used in the ritual. They had left it in the house. How was it here? In the motel room. Jack's hands trembled as he reached for the bedside lamp, his fingers fumbling with the switch. The light flickered on, casting a dim glow across the room. The mirror stood silently in the corner, its surface smooth and flawless. But as Jack stared into it, his reflection seemed wrong. Dark shadows writhed beneath the glass, twisting and distorting his face into something unrecognizable. "Emily," Jack whispered, his voice trembling. "Look." Emily turned to the mirror, her face pale with terror. And then they saw it. Just behind their reflection, standing in the shadows of the room, was Victor Grayson. His face twisted into a sinister grin, his eyes burning with malevolent light. "We never finished the ritual," Jack realized, his voice barely audible. "We didn't send him away. He's still here before either of them could move." The mirror shattered. A deafening crack split the air and shards of glass flew across the room, as if the mirror had exploded from the inside. The lights flickered and the room plunged into darkness. And then from the shadows the growling began again. Jack and Emily scrambled out of bed, their hearts racing, their minds in a frenzy. Grayson's laughter echoed around them, filling the room with a sound so cold, so dark that it chilled them to their bones. "You can't run," the voice hissed. "You belong to me." Suddenly the room twisted, the walls warping just like they had in the house. Jack and Emily stumbled toward the door, but it slammed shut before they could reach it. They were trapped. The shadows in the room began to move, crawling toward them, reaching for them. Jack grabbed Emily's hand, his mind racing for a solution. But there was no escape. "Jack," Emily whispered, her voice shaking with terror. "What do we do?" The growling grew louder, more aggressive. The air was thick with malice, and Victor Grayson's figure loomed over them, his face a mask of pure evil. Jack's mind raced, but he knew there was only one thing left to do. "We have to finish it," Jack said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "The ritual, we have to finish it now." With trembling hands, Jack and Emily knelt on the floor, reciting the words from the ritual. The air around them crackled with energy and the shadows seemed to recoil, but Grayson's figure remained, his laughter growing louder, more mocking. "You think you can banish me?" Grayson snarled, stepping closer. "I am eternal. You can never escape." But Jack and Emily kept chanting, their voices rising above the noise, desperate to finish the ritual. The candles, still flickering from before, suddenly flared to life, and the room was filled with a blinding light. Grayson's figure howled in rage, his twisted form writhing in the light. The shadows around him shrank, retreating into the corners of the room. The mirror, now shattered, seemed to pulse with energy, drawing the shadows toward it. "Finish it, Jack," Emily cried, her voice desperate. With a final shout, Jack recited the last words of the ritual. The air around them exploded with energy, and Grayson's figure was pulled violently into the mirror, his screams echoing in the room. The light flared one last time, and then silence. The room was still. The air was calm. It was over. Jack and Emily collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. The mirror was gone, reduced to nothing but dust, and the oppressive darkness that had filled the room had vanished. Victor Grayson was gone this time for good. As dawn broke, Jack and Emily sat outside the motel watching the sun rise over the horizon. The nightmare was finally over, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they felt free. They had survived. Maple Street and the curse of Victor Grayson was behind them, and as the morning light bathed the world in warmth, Jack took Emily's hand and smiled. It was over for now. Hey everyone, it's Ghost Boy signing off. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to like, share, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss another dark tale. And make sure to comment below. What would you have done if you were in that house? Now, what can we take away from this story? No matter how deep the shadows go, confronting your fears is the only way out. Sometimes the real danger is letting fear control you, and not every spirit is ready to rest. So stay brave, stay curious, and remember, the darkest stories are still untold. Until next time, keep your lights on.